Hi.
Hi, I just want to welcome you all to our Socio-Technical Cybersecurity Lecture Series that we have launched to try to increase the discussion, the awareness, and the progress in the area of cybersecurity that involves people. Um, and uh, um, I want to thank Sean and Sarah for having done all this work and pulling this together. And I'm going to hand this off to Sean.
Great. And I would like to introduce our guest speaker for today. James Shires is an assistant professor at the Institute for Security and Global Affairs at the University of Leiden and a fellow with the Cyber Statecraft Initiative at the Atlantic Council. He's written many articles and policy papers on cybersecurity, disinformation, and international politics, and has won awards from the Hague Program on Cyber Norms and the German Marshall Fund and the International Institute for Strategic Studies. His forthcoming book, The Politics of Cybersecurity in the Middle East, will be available from Hearst Oxford University Press in the upcoming summer 2021. James, would you like to take it from here?
Sean, thanks very much for the introduction, and Keith and Sean, I really appreciate the invitation. It's really nice to be here talking about my research with all of you. As Sean said, I'm an assistant professor at the Institute of Security and Global Affairs. This is an interdisciplinary institute at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, and I'm part of their cybersecurity governance research group. It means I teach and research on cybersecurity governance, but also, given my background in international relations and political science, also on political science topics more broadly. For example, earlier this week, I was giving a first-year bachelor's course on the Syrian conflict, and I was trying to introduce the students to the concept of socio-technical systems and think about how the internet has been used and manipulated in that conflict. So I'm really pleased that we're talking again into a socio-technical research group, and to have this idea of socio-technical systems and interactions at the core of the seminar series. I think is a really fantastic idea. I'm going to talk about some of my recent work on hack and leak operations for the next 40 minutes or so, and then hopefully we can have a good discussion on this or on any other topics you'd like to talk to me about, any other research you've read after that. I'm very happy to take clarification questions in the webinar itself as we go through. If there's something you don't understand, please let me know. But any sort of substantive discussion questions, let's save them for the end, and then let's have a discussion. So without any further ado, let me share my screen and let's begin. So hopefully you should all be able to see this now. And that's just the intro slide. So you can make sure all the affiliations are there. No one's going to be sad that they didn't get credit. Atlantic Council, University of Leiden, they're all happy. So I'm talking about hack and leak operations. And first of all, it's always good to start with a bit of definition. So I'll talk a bit about what a hack and leak operation is, how I've conceptualized it in various writings, and maybe also what it's not as well. I then go and talk into the specific cases I analyze in my recent paper for the Texas National Security Review, the simulation scandal, and then hopefully we'll draw out some theoretical and some policy insights from this empirical case study. So let's start with the second part of the hack and leak operation. I'm going to start with that because hopefully most of you will be familiar, if it's a cybersecurity group, with what a hack is. You'll know that it's not necessarily the most precise terminology, but by a hack I generally mean the unauthorized or adversarial compromise of a network or system. And so, hack is a layman's term, but it sort of fits nicely into this broader operation. What people are usually less clear about is leaks, and so it's worth going into a little bit more detail about how I think about leaks and maybe how this is different to how they're often used in, say, the media and some areas of at least political science as well. So a leak is the release of secret information into the public domain outside standard practices of disclosure. And for me, this last clause is really important. Everyone knows that leaks are sort of secret or confidential information. Hopefully, it's also unsurprising that leaks have to end up in the public domain. So eventually, even if they go through intermediaries, and we'll talk more about intermediaries later on, they do end up with publicly available knowledge. But outside standard practice of disclosure puts a little bit of a twist on this definition of leaking. It's not a clear sort of classification question. Those in the military or the intelligence services in the US will be familiar with sort of why you would have different classifications of information. But standard practices of disclosure could also include, tips to journalists. They could include sort of conversations at bars with politicians, things like this, right? So this is not just a formal rule-based security and classification of information. It's also a practice-based one as well. And so a leak is something that happens outside these standard practices. If tips to journalists become accepted practices, this is almost as less leaky. And something that is outside these practices is more leaky. So from that, we're not only looking at a practice-based definition of a leak, we're also looking at a spectrum-based definition. We can think about leaks in a few different dimensions for these spectrums. The first, which I mentioned, is secrecy and publicity. So a leak that goes from very top secret or highly confidential or even highly private, right, for a much less formal idea of secrecy, to one that goes to everyone in the world overall, moves from very secret to very public. That's sort of high level of leakiness, if you like that terminology. You can have various movements along this scale instead, and these are all sort of movements towards the leaking of information. The last dimension on this slide is the practice-based definition I talked about just now. So the fact that a particular practice of disclosure becomes the accepted practice, becomes the norm, that makes it less leaky. The rarer the practice is, the more outside expectations, normal behaviors it is, that makes it more leaky. Okay. And then there's also a interesting spectrum of reliability as well. So when we think about leaks, generally we think about things that expose certain information. And in order to expose truth, information, this has to be a reliable source. If something is not reliable, if it's made up, if it's falsehoods, then we wouldn't really call that a leak. This gets very much into the topic of disinformation, and this is an aspect of my research, how we think about disinformation. But I'm not going to talk too much about that today. I just want to highlight that this question of reliability and tainted leaks, falsehoods masquerading as leaks is really bound up with what we have included in our concept of leak overall. So that's leaks. Hopefully that seems relatively clear. And so let's move on to combining those with hacks and leaks. So as I said, the hack, simply an unauthorized intrusion into a computer network. Yes, there's a broader idea of hacking, which is anything that's sort of unexpected, trying to get around the rules of the system, by using it as intrusion. And I also am aware that many forms of cybersecurity threats and preventions don't necessarily focus on intrusion. So this is slightly narrower than you might think of in a broader cybersecurity threat model. For example, DDoS attacks, this kind of thing. But I'm talking about a hack as an intrusion into computer networks. And the leak is a non-standard public release of information. Now, you can see this sort of crescent moon shape on the Venn diagram. Hack and leak operations are right in the middle of hacks and leaks, but there's also a sort of hack-esque or hack-associated type set of leaks where digital technologies and are used in leaking, and they often get called, they get named Hacken leaks as well. So they say this leak was hacked in some way, even though it didn't result from an unauthorized intrusion into computer networks. A really good example is, for those of you who follow Saudi politics, was the killing of Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Turkey a couple of years back. People only really knew about that because they had access to recordings that were likely from bugs from the Turkish intelligence services. Everyone's like, this is a sort of hacked leak. We know about this. This is all come into the public domain. It's revealed this shocking secret about his killing, and this is all due to hacking. Now, in my definition, this isn't a hacked leak. Right? You're trying to conduct surveillance, installing bugs. It's not necessarily unauthorized intrusion, and so that probably wouldn't fit in my definition. But there's a wide set of leaks in this vein. You might also think about the paradigm examples of national security leaks in the US, right? The Bradley Manning, now Chelsea Manning leaks, and the Edward Snowden leaks as well. You know, to what extent were these hacked? Yes, they used digital tools to collect vast amounts of information. Yes, they maybe tried to improve their access. Snowden, for example, already had extensive access to these systems, but Manning did try and get beyond their original permissions. And so maybe that is a bit of hacking in there, but it's not the kind of thing I'm really looking at in hack and leak operations. These are much more sort of insider leaks. So it's worth being aware of this sort of broader penumbra of digitally connected leaks as well as hacking. Now, why would actors conduct hack and leak operations? I want to distinguish between two different motivations, mainly in order to say I'm only looking at one of them. And so I say there are two broad motivations for this: political motivations and financial motivations, and I'm only really going to look at the former. So I'm interested in politically motivated hack and leak operations. On the financial side, I'm sure you can all think of examples of where this might come out, either from the news or maybe, hopefully not, but from your own experience. So hack and obviously unauthorized intrusions can need to be conducted for fraud, identity theft, ransomware, and this kind of cyber criminal behavior. And sometimes these lead to leaks. Right? So maybe cyber criminals might put a sample of the stuff that they've taken, the information they've exfiltrated online, to show that they've actually done it. They might do this as a threat to say, if we'll put more online, if you don't pay us or you don't do what we want you to, or just as proof to others in their community on these forums to show that they're actually genuine, that they can actually have the skills and they have the ability to get the information that they claim. Right? So there's lots of reasons that you might see hack and leak operations occurring for financial reasons. Some of these are better known as data breaches, and a lot of good work has gone into identifying, cataloging different kinds, sizes, causes of data breaches across cybersecurity research. I'm not going to talk about this kind of financially motivated hack and leak operation. I'm more interested in the political side, and so for those of you who are coming from a political science perspective, they do differentiate between different kinds of political motivations, hacktivism, so there's non-state actors with politically motivated, maybe value motivated interventions, espionage, states trying to gather intelligence, and then getting towards conflict and ideas of cyber war. Where politically motivated hack and leak operations fit in, that is the question I want to address today. I will just say that there are also sort of hack and leak operations that I'm working on now in terms of my own research that are neither politically nor financially motivated, but actually have a lot more to do with interpersonal relations. So we can also think about a category of hack and leak operations that, for example, might work in terms of intimate partner relations, intimate partner abuse, maybe also sexual abuse involving online imagery, more commonly known as revenge porn, putting images online you might have access through illicit means. So there is a category of hack and leak operations that comes from more from interpersonal relations. Again, I'm not going to talk about that today. So what's the big argument of the paper? So the paper argues that hack and leak operations are what I call the simulation of scandal. And by that, I mean that they are strategic attempts to direct public moral judgment against the operation's target. Now, that's a slightly convoluted definition. So as always, let's hope some sort of slightly funky graphics will make it clearer. This is the sort of ideal typical model of a hack and leak operation, right? So from the target of the leak in the bottom right-hand corner, the hacker gets access to this information, and then they put it online. Right? So this is a sort of initial relationship that we have in a hack and leak operation, right? So you have access to information from the target of the operation. But why are they doing this? Right? So why have they put this information, the iconic document in the middle, online? And the red line, the red arrow, is what I want to make the argument about. Right? And this red arrow suggests that what they're trying to do is not just put something online, leak information. There's an ulterior motive to that. The purpose is to direct public moral judgment against the target. Right? So there is an extra step in the hack and leak operation that isn't covered by either the hack or the leak. It's then the consequent social impact of the operation on the target. Right? And in all the cases that I examine, that I'll talk about later, there is this next step, this sort of moral judgment, this normative condemnation of whatever the target was doing that's been exposed by the leak. Right? So that's the sort of ideal, typical model of a hack and leak operation, maybe from the active. Right? This is how the hacker, the malicious actor, wants it to work. But, right, and this is the big but, is that hack and leak operations don't always work in this way, right? And this is the other key point of the paper, is that it doesn't always play out in the way that the hacker imagines, right? In many cases, actually, the discovery of the hack and leak operation itself, the discovery of the fact that the information was obtained through the intrusion into computer networks, this becomes a scandal in itself, right? This becomes a subject of normative condemnation, of public moral judgment. That's an essential part of the idea of a scandal. So the scandal becomes about the hack itself, not about the hacked information. So the public moral judgment is not against the target based on the content of the information. It actually becomes directed back at the hacker who's been revealed as the source, right? And then says, well, this is far more scandalous, this is far more concerning than whatever is in the content. So you have two possible directions in which a hack and leak operation can go. You have some of them where they do work as intended, they create a scandal about the target, and others where the majority of the scandal, the sort of main focus of attention afterwards, is on the hacker themselves. And maybe you can already think about this in terms of big hack and leak operations in the US, the DNC hack before the 2016 elections, right? Think about the tussle and the struggle to point the scandal in different directions, right? To point it at the Russian intelligence agencies who were attributed as the source of the operation, or to point it in the other direction, so maybe at the content of revelations around the Democratic National Committee or what Hillary Clinton was doing. Right, so in these paradigm examples of hack and leak operations, we can see these two directions competing already. I just quick check the time. Now I want to get into the empirical case studies that I focus on in the article, trying to think through a little bit further this idea of simulation of scandal. And the cases I look at are not the ones that I talked about just now. They're not the ones that are the big Russian interventions in US elections. And partly because my personal view is that our study of hacking league operations, often our study of disinformation itself, is overly oriented towards this single operation, right? Towards the evidence released in the Mueller report, to the focus on troll farms and things like that coming from Russian intelligence agencies. So my view, especially in terms of the political science of this, is that we need to broaden our evidence base for hacking league operations. I've done that a couple of times in other writing, trying to look at hacking league operations that took place in very different political contexts. Because I have a focus on the Middle East, I also looked at hacking operations in Saudi Arabia, for example. Right, very different results, very different consequences to those that happened in a US electoral context, as you can imagine. But in this paper on the simulation of scandal, I do stay within the US. And this research was conducted while I was at the Belfer Center at Harvard Kennedy School. So I thought, this is a good time to write about US politics. I'll never get closer to the people that are actually doing it than I can at the Kennedy School. So make the most of it. And I chose, again, people who are in US politics, people who are actually also named and involved in these sort of electoral questions around the 2016 election. Some of them sort of tried to intervene, especially Elliot Brody was very much in the Republican side. Others, Yusuf Al-Otaiba was, still is, the UAE ambassador to the US, and although he's got very good connections on both sides of the aisle in Washington DC, he does have very strong connections to the Republican side as well. Others, Farhad Azima is an Iranian American businessman with long sort of ties back to both the Middle East politics and various political events in the US. And I presume you don't need to say anything about it. The last one is that's Jeff Bezos. In this context, actually, what I should say is not that he's the CEO of Amazon, but that he's the owner of the Washington Post. And that's the fact that maybe is worth stressing, given the Post's political leanings, its stories about Jamal Khashoggi, and also its orientation within the politics of the Gulf against Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So I can talk for much longer about the politics of the Gulf, but I'm not going to do that now. The main point I want to get across is that all these 4 individuals were subject of hacking league operations in roughly the same time period. So around the 2016 elections, and in the year or so afterwards, you had hacking league operations against all these 4 individuals. And you also had these hacking league operations attributed to Gulf states, like 2 different Gulf states. And I'll talk more about this attribution in a sec. But what I tried to do is to highlight all the main details of these hack and leak operations before we can then get into assessing their impact. And so I'll just put up a table here. There's quite a lot of information on it. Don't feel you have to read it all, but I'll just go through a couple of key details. So the first thing to say is that although these were all attributed to Gulf states, you can see the UAE, Qatar, and then Saudi Arabia. This was a public attribution, right? This is based on sources, and in all cases, it was denied. So as with most cyber attacks, most cyber operations in international politics, there's never a final answer as to who did what. There are accusations and there are denials. The second row focuses on the intermediary or not the intermediary, the leaking actor itself, right? Because even when the attribution of the Hackney operation was connected to a nation state, was connected to a particular Gulf state, the identity of the leaker who contacted journalists, who actually put the information online, was not overtly connected to the state. Perhaps unsurprisingly. What's interesting, though, is that sometimes they were claiming to be a sort of activist identity, right? Trying to act for moral reasons, trying to highlight wrongdoing, political corruption, this kind of thing. And definitely the case for Brody and Al-Otaiba, there was a sort of activist component to the leaker's identity. And this, again, mirrors what we saw in the DNC operation, where you do get the sort of DC leaks email. You have Hollywood leaks in the case of Brody, and global leaks in the case of Al-Otaiba. So, they're trying to play off these identities that are already in the public domain. The next row is about the attribution in a little bit more detail, not just at the level of the nation state to say this is the states that were doing it, but also to who they hired in order to do it, right? So as a state, you have lots of resources. It's interesting for me that in lots of these cases, these Hackney operations were attributed not just to states, but to PR agencies working on behalf of states. PR agencies actually aren't in the roll call of usual cybersecurity threat actors. At least they haven't been for a long time. Maybe if we're thinking about Hackney operations, if we're thinking about social media manipulation, we get more into the disinformation space. We need to think far more about these PR and public relations and sort of gray zone marketing type stuff that's going on. Right, so that's something that is interesting for me. As we go further down, this is the type of release, right? How it came into the public domain is interesting for me because there's a lot of conversation around social media, around disinformation and leaks and their virality and their spread on social media in this kind of research. In all these cases, actually, these were very old school, right? The leaking identity, the supposed activist or whoever it was, actually trying very hard to coordinate that leaks with respected papers, right? With the New York Times, with the Associated Press, that kind of thing. They'll go back and forth to these different papers, try and give them a little bit of a flavor, try and get them to run the story, that kind of thing, right? So we're going quite a long way back in our leaking history, right? Think of Watergate, think of these kind of sort of traditional media relationships, rather than like a sudden virality of misinformation on social media. The scandal varies, as you can see, the focus of the wrongdoing, right? Let's go back to the idea of public moral judgment. The moral judgment was corruption, it was political exposure, sometimes it was violation of norms, especially in the Al-Otaiba case, norms that you expect in UAE society not being adhered to in the US. They had a different format, as you can see. They took a different format, and also they garnered different responses. Right? So some Al-Otaiba was like, well, let's just try and wait for this all to blow over. The others generally tried to legalize and went into lawfare. So they issued lawsuits against sometimes the nation state, sometimes the intermediary actors, and also conducted their own technical investigation and their own PR campaigns as well. And this is quite important. I'll come back to this. As I have around 10 to 15 minutes left, let's move on. And so this was the overview of the Hackney operations that I investigated. In the paper, I sort of give a bit more of a flavor of how they all unfolded. So if you don't like the table format, if that's a bit sort of dry and dusty for you, then I do encourage you to go and read the narrative in the paper itself. Let's move on now to think about the impact of Hackney operations. So what did I do to try and understand the impact of Hackney operations and sort of parse it out in these 4 different cases? And remember, we're looking for the difference between when the scandal, the public moral judgment, is directed at the target of the operation, right? Those are the 4 individuals I mentioned earlier, or when it's directed back at the hacker or the attributed source of the hack, which in this case is the Gulf state that's publicly attributed. What I did was firstly to try and get a sense of where the focus of media coverage went on this issue, right? Whether it went in the target direction or hack direction. And I call this, is this a focus on the hack or a focus on the leak from coverage of these hack and leak operations? In terms of coverage itself, you can see the sort of key stories. So as you can imagine, they were linked, they were covered in these papers of record, covered in these well-respected newspapers. Unsurprisingly, because that's the whole point of the hack and leak operation, was to get it into the New York Times, to get it into the Washington Post. And they were recovered repeatedly over a period of time, right? And this is something that maybe it's worth highlighting, right? That when you have a leak, especially a hack and leak operation, we saw the strategic intent of these leaking identities to try and get multiple releases of leaked information to regenerate the scandal. Right? You can see in this each case, although it does fall down a bit, there still are multiple spikes. In each case, as more information is released, as journalists discover another angle that they can use to promote the story. Right? So again, the commercial motivations of big media organizations, right? This quick news cycle, trying to find something that is a scoop and will redirect attention, get more clicks. It's really important. So this is an interesting graph in terms of how coverage develops over time. But this graph doesn't tell us in what way the coverage went. Right? It doesn't tell us whether the coverage was about the hack, mainly about the hacker, or mainly about the content of hack leak operation, mainly about the leak. This is not an easy distinction. Obviously, there's always a bit of both. But I tried to code these articles, all these instances of news coverage, and try and work out which side they generally sat. And these were the results.
Clarification question, James.
Yeah, definitely.
The slide. What are the blue peaks? You've got color codes for gray, white, red, and black.
That's true. So in an earlier version of this research, I did include another hack and leak operation. So this is a graph from an earlier version of research, and I grayed out that operation from this one. So ignore the blue peaks. Hopefully that goes through, but yeah, that's the that's what they were. And as you can see, this research evolves over time, as I'm sure you're familiar. So those are the sort of the spread of the coverage, and let's look at how the coverage divided itself. Right? And so I was quite surprised by this, but for me, this was very interesting. You can see that, first of all, it changes, right? That this is not the same in each case. That it's not that it's 50-50 split between hack and leak in each cases. It's not that the media are generally really concerned about the salacious details of the leak over the hack. And it's also not the case that in every case, the hack is always far more newsworthy. Right? It really does differ depending on the cases. You can see in the Alataba case, the focus was mainly on the leak. In the Brody case, roughly 50-50. Also in the Azima case, but then we did have far fewer stories overall, so the volume of coverage was lower in that case. And for the Bezos case, it is far more focused on the hack, right? The fact that Jeff Bezos' phone had reportedly been hacked that dominated news coverage more so than the content of the leak. Now, I should say that these are not numbers of all stories about the case. That's far greater. These are the key releases And in lots of cases, when you have, say, Associated Press reporting something, that will then get picked up by multiple news organizations that will be bought by lots of others, and it will be repeated. So each of these instances generates 10, 20, 50 different stories, publications across different news sites. But they all link back, and they sometimes word for word repeat that original publication. So I only included the ones where they were sort of the original source, not the multiple sort of derivative publications. And this variation leads us to ask, well, why? Right? Well, why do we have different results in different cases? It's not an easy question to ask, and there are always going to be lots of different factors at play. But what I want to do is just highlight a few of the factors that I think were important based on this analysis and the sort of qualitative investigation of these 4 cases, and then try and go through to some policy implications and maybe broaden it out to a US policy context as well, a foreign policy context. So the first point I want to make is that these are all relatively low resource options for nation states. So engaging this kind of stuff is not expensive. Yes, PR agencies are not cheap for most of us, but if you're a state actor, it's not you're not investing, you're not buying new arms, you're not trying to do something radically expensive. So these are quite easy to do. It doesn't really matter if they fully achieve their goal. You may as well try it. The first sort of thing that I thought may have an impact is that the format of the leaked information sort of affects the impact as well. And this is something that I'm interested in because, again, in terms of socio-technical interactions, right? I'm talking a lot about the social level here, but actually, if you do have, say, emails, a large dump of emails, as opposed to 1 or 2, say, salacious pictures or a couple of screenshots, right? That actually means that journalists treat it in really different ways. A few screenshots of a Hotmail account or a single picture from an iPhone compared to vast quantities of emails means that journalists will do different things. They will go through it in different ways. They will use search queries. They will try and organize databases of material. Right? I think back to the Snowden leaks, how this worked. And so it's volume, but also format means that journalists treat it differently. That then means that the scandal goes in a different direction because it's easy to have multiple releases if you're constantly discovering new information, right? If you put out the first story or tranche, and then you go further on, and then you discover something else, you can then put out again. Right? So the way that journalists deal with, analyze this information depends on its format. In an earlier article, I look at the Saudi Arabian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. That was all PDFs of Arabic script that many international news organizations really struggled to deal with, right? They didn't have the right optical character recognition. They couldn't work with local news organizations because it was sensitive. So that really had a big impact as well. So this format thing, I think, for me, is interesting. The next thing I wanted to highlight is actually it's the target's response as well helps decide on which way the media coverage goes, into hack or into the leak elements of the incident. And if you remember back to the table, Alatable tried to downplay the whole thing, and as you can see, actually that didn't work very well, or it wasn't. The results were not particularly conducive, right? So a lot of people wrote about these leaks, even though they just tried to downplay it. Actually, a coordinated PR response, media messaging, and this technical investigation, all this stuff, actually, rather than displaying more about the target's biases or vulnerabilities, actually made media organizations write more about how the hack happened, right? And in that case, they directed more questions on, well, if it happened in this way, who did it? maybe we can know more about who did it because we're getting more access to information about how it went on. So maybe a bit more openness and strategic or carefully calculated messaging on how the hack took place through the initial response helps people focus on different elements. And then finally, the first point I mentioned in the table is this idea of the activist identity. Having a cover identity, so this is in especially the Brody case, does help to shift focus onto the content of the leak, even if it's implausibly deniable. So the journalists who were talking to these supposed activist leaking entities, they weren't falling for the activist claim, right? They were, they talked about this in detail after it happened, on the public record, and they were very clear that at the time that this was going on, they did not think this was sort of a genuine do-gooder trying to release show corruption happening in the world. On the other hand, they thought, well, we do have commercial targets to meet, and we do have to publish news-worthy information, often no matter its source. So we're going to focus on the content itself. So it's not about cover identities in the sense that people often think them about in terms of political science, where actually it means that you don't know who did it, right? Or it misdirects people. Actually, in this case, it just provided enough of a fig leaf that journalists would run with the story, and they wouldn't say, well, we know this is coming from a super biased actor who is doing this maliciously, and we don't want to be their tool of doing this, right? That's more the level and the sort of precision with which these cover identities work. They don't effectively hide attribution. So those were my takeaways from 4 cases. What can we think about this in terms of policy implications? Maybe most obviously, hacking leak operations take many different forms. So different policy tools would be appropriate for a hacking leak operation by state-sponsored actors, maybe cyber criminals, financially motivated ones, lobbying companies, right? And we do even see these happening in, say, college political associations, right? So this is a relatively cheap resource. There are a lot of people doing it. From my point of view as an international relations and political science perspective, I'm really fascinated by the fact that this is both a domestic and an international story. Right? These are international, international actors, right? Foreign actors engaging in US politics, but in a way that is really entwined, right? They're ambassadors, they're lobbyists, but they also have business interests in the Gulf, right? There's really no way of distinguishing or pulling apart sort of domestic politics and international politics. It's an important point for me. And finally, you might have noticed that these are all wealthy men in the 4 pictures I put forward. We should really think about the disproportionate impacts on women and people of color around due to social expectations of what constitutes scandalous behavior. Right? I did say at the start these were financial and political and also moral scandals, right? There's a lot of stuff about sexual behavior, about affairs and parties and womanizing and that kind of thing. These are all things that are really tied up to the identity of the actor who you're targeting. Right? So if we're thinking about that, we should really think about different kinds of identities and how they're disproportionately impacted by hacking leak operations. I'm aware I'm nearly out of time. I just want to highlight that this is not just a question that the US has to think about in terms of defensive policy, right? We can also think about this happening as an issue of offensive policy in the US, right? You know that in some cases, some famous leaks like the Panama Papers have been attributed with questionable accuracy to the US. So the Putin thinks that it's a CIA operation. Others are maybe slightly more plausible, right? That Iranian cyber espionage teams, their tools, their code bases, their internal chats have been leaked online. Maybe that's the kind of thing that Cyber Command thinks it should be doing at the moment, right? Especially under a doctrine of persistent engagement, those of you who are into US cyber policy. And it keeps on going, right? So we can talk more about how issues of disinformation should build and build and build. These issues are definitely not settled. You still see new stories come forward. You still see developments in these events. So I very much took a snapshot. It could not and could never have been the final word. Thank you very much. I hope that was not too brief a tour of Hack and Leak operations, the Gulf states and US politics, gave an introduction into what I call the simulation of scandal, and hopefully showed you why I try and think about Hack and Leak operations in that way. I'll stop now, and hopefully we can have a little bit of time for questions.
Great, thank you, James. I don't see any questions preloaded into the Q&A, but I do want to give everyone a chance to ask questions at the moment. I haven't allowed a talk button we can try out if you'd like to ask a question rather than type one in. Do we have any immediate questions? Okay, I know we don't have any at the moment. Rachel, you and I were messaging on the side. You had a question for James about some of his other work. Oh, Rachel.
We have a question up on where do you see the future direction?
There we go. Susan Winter asks, what do you see as future directions for this work?
Yeah, that's a good question. And for me, I guess there's some future directions that I would take it in, and there's other future directions that I hope others would take it in. In terms of my work, I'm still very interested in the result of hack and leak operations in different political contexts. So maybe this is just me as I change jobs, but I'm also writing a bit more about what's going on in the Netherlands and in the UK, and how hack and leak operations really do function differently based on different assumptions in the media environment. If you think about Macron leak, the French elections, they don't have the same kind of really partisan, really antagonistic media environment that the US does. So maybe that was part of the story about why the Macron leaks really didn't take off in the same way the DC did. So I think this question of political context, both in terms of defensively how media cope with it, but also what are the assumptions of the actors, especially if they're foreign actors, if they're from a different state, when they carry out the operation, what's the sort of thing that they think is going to be a scandal that then doesn't maybe work, it fizzles out, something like that. So these different political contexts, I think, are important. I also think it's really important to broaden the frame of hack and leak operations as well. As I said, bring it into questions of interpersonal relationships, questions of impact on different identities. I think about different levels of hack and leak operations. That's really important as well. And then finally, I know Sean mentioned the book that's coming out next year. In that, I talk about how we can think about hack and leak operations as between emerging sort of bodies of research and knowledge. On one hand, you have sort of cybersecurity, really concerned about networks and intrusion and things like that, and then you have disinformation, which is equally powerful a form of research at the moment. It gets resources, it gets attention, right? And so maybe these two bodies of research aren't necessarily talking to each other as much as they should. And they're very parallels. Like they use very similar kinds of investigative techniques. They make very similar assumptions around sort of what is behavior. They use concepts, but maybe they sort of are not really seeing eye to eye. Maybe the impact of these operations and how best it. So I see something as trying to bridge what are rapidly becoming disparate fields as well.
Great, thank you. Wayne Letters has a question, says, very engaging talk, many thanks. Interested in your insights, RE format. For the larger data dumps where new discoveries can trickle out, e.g. Panama Papers, Cyprus EU citizenship for sale, etc., how effective is this at countering the forces that want to hush and disappear the info, get it out of the news cycle? Ultimately, what has the greatest lasting impact? Better to have a big bang or a sustained leak?
Oh, I was going to say, I mean, if I'm looking for engaging ways of describing this kind of stuff, then I should definitely lean on Wayne to talk about big bangs and sustained leak. So I'd actually go for the sustained leak, and this is what I am increasingly beginning to think, especially when there are really large volumes of data here, so such as the kind of papers, things like that. Because you're always going to get a bit of a bite on the first one because it's new, because it's different. And the question then for those who are strategic looking to maximize the impact of the leak is how far you can re-grab people's attention. Now, there's an interesting question here, and journalists, again, this is why we need to really know media and communication studies well, because journalists for a long time have thought about the best placement of news, right? Very strategically thinking about when to hold back information for later cycles. But as you say, as I said, this is also related to format as well, right? It's just not possible for stretch journalists who are trying to produce with clickbait articles day in and day out to really do deep investigative journalism unless they can continually justify it again and again. So I definitely think the sustained leak, where you have these repeated spikes, is probably the way we're going in more in future. But maybe we will also see this coming out of different organizations as well, right? So when you have, say, shared databases, shared document dumps going online, then you will have different people taking what they want out of it, coming from different angles, and then writing different stories for different audiences. So I see the sustained leak as being something, but I don't see that as sort of really giving one organization, one news organization, or owner of that data the precedence. What I see is that sort of really diffusing into different interest groups.
Great, thanks. And I have a couple questions myself as well. Early on, when you had that large table with the different cases that you were presenting, looked like about half of them, 2 had dashes under like the identity of the hacker. So if I heard you correctly, part of your premise of this hack and leak, though, is the stressor on identifying the hacker. So what is it about those 2 particular cases where it's unknown where the information came from, as you put it into this double-edged sword?
So let's go back. This is the leaker's assumed identity, right? And what you have here is not that there wasn't a sort of a gap between the attributed actor and the target, but it's that they didn't consciously try and assume a different identity, right? So in the Farhad Azima case, they just put these things online. They put on a website, they sort of dumped the documents on there, and they didn't sort of say, we are a leaking organization. There wasn't any sort of fake politics about it. The Jeff Bezos case is a bit more complicated because it involves a tabloid paper and the National Enquirer, and also a parallel sourcing question, whether the leaked documents in this case, pictures of revealing Jeff Bezos' affair, came from the brother of the woman he was having an affair with, or from, as was reported, Saudi or some sort of malware that was bought by the Saudi state that was installed on the phone. Right, so in that case, you have sort of an interesting question: parallel sourcing. It's still not resolved. Right, we have competing interpretations in public domain. In the Farhad Azima case, you don't have a clear motivation. In the Farhad Azima case, though, actually, that is one that's progressed since I wrote the article, and we do see more and more that it was this commercial dispute where the competition. So he was in this commercial dispute with a UAE investment authority, Rakia, and they were trying to essentially smear his reputation. There's documents in the UK courts at the moment that say that without, even though this was the case, right, even though this is maybe sort of strategic information, it's not necessarily the case that we shouldn't consider it in our court judgments, in our legal proceedings. So the reason I put dashes there is because there wasn't a clear political claim being made about the identity of the actor. There was more sort of controversy and confusion in that case.
Great, thanks. And another question then about some of the sampling you had. You said you selected some of these cases when you were looking at the counts as to those that were more of, I think you used the term sort of like key releases, things like the AP. So how did you distinguish what would be a key release versus a non-key release? And if you could also then follow up, you said a lot of these then were also targeting out towards working with larger institutions like media corporations, papers and whatnot. And how does that compare against if you were to broaden your analysis to include something that's more environmental, like social media writ large?
Yeah. So on the first one, because that's a slightly easier question, it's two things. One, how do I know what a sort of key release is and what isn't a key release? One is timing. So often you see within hours or on the same day a slew of stories. And so the first one of those stories, I would say, is a key release. And then that is also content, because once you look at those stories in detail, so say you have 20 or 30 stories about Elliot Brody in one day, the AP is the first one. If you look at the other ones, they are derivative in terms of content as well. So they're referencing the same information. Often they are actually they've just purchased the text from AP, right? So they're just repeating the story and badging it on their website. So that's why I didn't feel that I should count them as sort of separate, maybe interventions or attempts at scandal. They're sort of more like duplications, and that's why I didn't include them. So it's timing and content. On the second question, this is really interesting, and to be perfectly honest, I didn't have data in this study to really do a comparative test. So what would have been great would be to say, well, I know this is how it happened for big papers. I know that the Hack and Leak actors were trying to get their stories into big papers, but what was the effect on social media, right? So were these New York Times articles, were these AP articles shared mainly on social media, or were they read by subscriptions or online, that kind of thing? So that kind of consumption question, right, and the sharing question is one that would be really interesting. It's something I just didn't have access to for this research, but to go back to the question of what should other people do in the future, they should definitely do that. They should combine social media research, which at the moment is very much platform-based often, right? It's trying to see how something goes viral on Twitter or on Facebook, with this sort of broader cross-platform or outside platform impact of these operations. So yeah, I'm sorry I don't have an answer to your question, but definitely something people can think about.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. And we're coming up on 12 o'clock, so we'll respect the time. But as we wind down, James had on his last slide. Slides will be made available shortly after the talk once we get the video processed as well, where he has extra papers similar to this topic if you'd like to read up on. I'd also like to recommend another 2020 paper he has published in Contemporary Security Policy called Cyber Noir, Cybersecurity and Popular Culture, which is how James came to be known to the Socio-Technical Cybersecurity Group. That paper is linked on our website under our 2020 summer reading section if you'd like to check that out. Then also I'd like to give a shout out. We're going to take a break for the winter holiday. And when we come back, we will be having our next speaker on February 11th. And we will be having Shahan Talish from UIC. He's a professor of law, and he'll be talking about the role of cyber insurance on cybersecurity of commercial operations. So our previous speaker was looking more at local government and cybersecurity readiness. James brought us an international perspective and media angle. And then our next speaker will bring us into the commercial sector and how the insurance viability is affecting cybersecurity. So with that, I thank everybody for attending and hope you had a great time. Those of us that will be going with the meet and greet, you should have been sent a separate Zoom link to where you'll be able to come off of mute and fully engage. Hope to see you then. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Appreciate the discussion.